The video game industry is one of the biggest and powerful in the actual era. It born at the beginning of 1970s, being quite modest. We invite you to meet the protagonist of this story. Two men who worked in a military company and development an invention that revolutionized the entertainment industry. We will meet Rudolph H. Baer and William Harrison. We will give you a trip for the past and the life of these visionary men whose invention leaves an undeniable trace in the history of the 20th century.
Ladies and gentlemen, the demo which you're about to see and hopefully participate in represents some of the recent developments at Sanders. We're addressing ourselves today to Sanders' approach to a simple, quasi-interactive type of program origination with audience participation in a variety of modes in such a way as to appeal to a wide variety of customers. And what we've built we call the all-purpose box. The all-purpose box contains a cassette recorder. It contains a cradle on which a telephone headset can be rested. It contains a digital entry keyboard and a number of plug-in modules, electronic plug-in modules. The unit may have none of these, it may have one of these, two of these, three of these, or any number. The plug-in modules will cover a variety of applications such as the TV gaming, the study, the home study application, the impulse buying application we mentioned earlier, pay TV, and others we have thought about, and I'm sure many others that we have not thought about at the moment.
Video games are so much a part of our daily life that it's hard to imagine the excitement people felt when they first hit the market. Because that was the first time that your average guy had the opportunity to manipulate an image on his TV screen, which many still thought of as a mystery. The mystery of the magician with a glass face, as the Venezuelan author Eduardo Liendo once described television. Play has always been a part of the life of Homo sapiens, even before he was called Homo sapiens. You don't need to study animal psychology to understand that playing is an important part of the activities that higher mammals, especially their young, engage in throughout their lives. A game is any kind of mental or physical exercise that we do for the purpose of entertaining ourselves. In general, playing implies the simulation of real-life situations, whether it's to learn something or just to have fun. In either case, a game implies taking on a challenge which involves reacting to a circumstance that reflects a real-life situation, either to prepare for it, to overcome it, or to avoid it by symbolically dominating it. Even though war isn't a game at all, its dynamic often feels like what you'd find on a chessboard or in a video game. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that the man who's recognized as the father of home video games, German-born engineer Ralph Baer, was a refugee from World War II.
I was born in Germany in 1922, at a time when the western part of Germany was still occupied by French, Moroccan troops, and things were very, very dire, very bad. There wasn't much food around. There was lots of destruction. The town I was born in is on the border of France, Alsace-Lorraine, in the southwestern part of Germany. The town is called Pirmasens. My mother, who was born on the other side of the country, in a place called Guben on the Polish border, and had worked in Berlin in a chem lab. Couldn't wait to get out of Pirmasens. So when I was a year and a half old, my sister was a few months old, we moved to Cologne, big city, Köln am Rhein, Cologne. And that's where I grew up.
In Cologne, Baer attended the Realschule. When Hitler came to power, Baer was 14 years old, and his life changed forever. Since he was a German Jew, he had to quit school. And even though he was willing to study just about anything, the fact that he was Jewish made life impossible for him in a country where Jews were being actively persecuted.
I tried to apply at a plumber to become a plumber's apprentice, and he asked me whether I was willing to put my hands into other people's refuse, and I said yes, but I didn't get the job. I wound up in an office and did office work for the next 2 years. 14-year-old doing typing, 2 languages, German and English, doing shorthand, taking dictations from the boss. And when we finally decided to emigrate to the United States, I said goodbye to my boss. My mother and I went to visit him, and he told my mother that she didn't have anything to worry about because I did have a strong back. Yeah, obviously he didn't think much of my mental ability. So we were extremely lucky to be able to emigrate and come to the US because, number one, the quota was very small. Number two, it was a lottery. We went to the consulate, the German consulate in Stuttgart, and sat across the desk from the consul, the American consul. And I spoke English, my sister spoke pretty good English. My father did fairly well. We had a nice conversation. Who knows what that had to do with him signing off the paperwork. If he hadn't, more than likely it would have been, it would have been Auschwitz or someplace like that. So somebody up there has been looking out for me or something, for all these years.
In August 1938, the Baer family left Germany for New York, where they arrived as refugees, and where Ralph found the opportunity of his life.
We came to New York. I had to go to work. I worked in the factory for about 2 years. Within about 3 months of starting in the factory, I saw somebody on the subway reading a magazine. On the back of the magazine, it said, "Make big money in radio servicing, television servicing." That was for me, right? So I took a correspondence course, and out of the $12 a week that I earned at the factory, I spent $1.25 a week for the correspondence course. When I got done with the basic course, I took the advanced course. And when I got done with that, I quit the factory and talked myself into a radio serviceman's job in a store on Lexington Avenue and 78th Street in Manhattan. And they had another store on 3rd Avenue and 72nd, and we opened up a third one on the west side. And I did all the service work, all the pickup, all the deliveries, putting up antennas on the roof, and fixing early television sets, all without a car, no car. In and out of the buses, and with a chassis hanger from one hand, toolbox from the other hand, loudspeaker under the arm, no car.
That humble immigrant, whose take-home earnings were just pennies per day, was still a long way from becoming the inventor of a product which would eventually give birth to one of today's most powerful industries. As life would have it, Ralph Baer soon became involved in the very war he and his family had fled.
And I got drafted in 1943. Within 3 months, I started out in the combat engineers with all the other 6'2" Texans and Alabamans and Floridians. And I'm a New York boy who had never been outdoors and didn't know anything about holding a hammer.
Because of his command of the German language, as well as his proficiency in French and English, Baer was assigned to a U.S. Army special unit located in Europe, under General Dwight Eisenhower's orders.
And they looked at us and said, "Who the hell are you?" Right? We said, "Oh, we're the MIs." "Oh, okay." So for a few days, we did the usual drill. We marched up and down, and all this nonsense. And then 3 of us went to the commandant of the camp and said, "Hey, we can improve your training rating if you let us train the troops in recognition of German uniforms, German psychology, firing German weapons, and that sort of stuff. Next thing we know is we're cadre, you know, we're 6 levels above the peons. The regular guys were off to the side in a special barracks, and we built a school. I got involved in collecting weapons to demonstrate the weapons and to show the weapons. Before I knew it, a museum full of stuff. They got so involved in the history of these weapons that it got to be known in the British community, and English specialists, weapons specialists, they wanted me to stay in the Army, and I was tempted because I was so wrapped up in the history and the technology of the weapons. Because what's a gun? A gun is especially an automatic gun, pretty complex mechanism. It's fun to play with.
When the war ended, Baer went back to the United States and for a while forgot all about weapons. Then he got a job at the famous Emerson Radio Factory. But his ambition to succeed drove him to study radio and TV engineering at the American Television Institute of Technology in Chicago.
I left school at age 14 and never saw another schoolroom except for my home study work and the self-study I did in England. I studied algebra, algebra 1, algebra 2. I knew all this stuff, but I had no real credentials. So there was no way I could get into a New York college. But I saw an ad for a school in Chicago that trained technicians and engineers. I was not accredited at the time. I took a train to Chicago, interviewed, took a test, passed the test, and that's when I went to school there for the next 3.5 years. And eventually I became accredited, so I got a bona fide degree in television engineering.
After a brief period in a medical equipment company, Baer went to work at the Loral Electronics Factory, which was a defense contractor. And this is where his innovative spirit began to stand out.
When I started building ham gear, I bought a few magazines like QSD and CQ, which were the Bibles of the amateur radio people. I looked through them, I studied them, and I built stuff. I mean, any engineer can do this sort of stuff. And you learn by doing it. It's a lot of fun. But pretty soon we got major orders for military test equipment, mostly radar test equipment. And by the time a 1.5 years passed, we had so much work that we were out of money. We couldn't produce the stuff. It had to be bought up by another company to bring some money into the company. That company had another outfit in Manchester, New Hampshire.
Once in Manchester, New Hampshire, Baer changed jobs again and started work at Sanders Associated Corporation in Nashua, also in New Hampshire, where he spent the next 30 years of his life. At Sanders, which produced electronic equipment for the defense industry, Baer got back in touch with his old fascination with weaponry and, guided by his playful nature, began developing the very first video games, with help from his colleague, Bill Harrison.
This is 6-9 months before I came up with the idea for video games in September. When I needed a technician at that time, I called someone else, a guy by the name of Tremblay, and he built the vacuum tube chassis, and Bill was not involved. He got back on board in, I think it was January.
I had just come off of working on a sonoboid program, and I was doing paperwork, which I didn't like. So I had gotten a message from somebody that Ralph Baer wanted to see me, and I was on loan to this other system. It was the Ocean Systems version, and so I just jumped in my car and went over to the Canal Street plant and went up to see him, and he told me what it was all about, and I got showed the little bit he had done with the tube design, and the next thing I knew, I was over there and working.
The kinds of things we developed were projection television systems that did projected alphanumerics, which was brand new in those days. I came up with new methods with another guy for making multi-layer printed circuit boards. We experimented with making core memories with printed circuit techniques. The only thing I knew about transistors was what I observed looking over the shoulders of guys in the lab. And that was very disconcerting. So when we first started this video game activity, I had somebody on the bench for a few weeks building a vacuum tube chassis, 4 vacuum tubes that gave us some experience in putting a spot or a line on the screen, moving the line or moving the spot up and down, and putting some color in the background. We did it all in vacuum tubes. Why? That's all I knew. This is in September, October of '66, because I had written the first disclosure documents about video games on 1 September '66.
By early 1967, Baer and Harrison had begun developing the first chassis with transistors in it.
It was a big chassis into which we put some elementary circuitry for moving 2 spots around the screen so they could chase each other and wipe out the chase spot like a Fox and Hounds game.
Baer's idea was to make chase games, where a light beam emanating from a pencil-sized projector would try to hunt down a moving dot on the screen. And that's how the world's first optic sensor was invented.
First you color a spot, then you change the game rules and use a different overlay on the screen to make a different game. It was all very primitive, but the idea was to build something simple and cheap that you can sell for $25. Right? And in order to do that, we couldn't have a hell of a lot of components.
Understandably, Baer and Harrison's work attracted the attention of their co-workers at Sanders, and soon their superiors were asking them for a demonstration of their secret project.
We couldn't blow this one. We had to do a perfect demonstration. To make sure, I bought a tape recorder and I recorded the descriptions of each game. There were 7 games altogether. Each game, so we could play it and built a little 4.5 megahertz FM oscillator. I showed them how to do it because I'm an old radio frequency guy from way back when. And you put the audio into this oscillator, which makes an FM signal. You add that, sum that with a video signal, and it comes out in your television set right through your loudspeaker. So when the president and the executive VP, my boss, came to see the demonstration, I pushed the button on the tape recorder and says, game number 1 is a chase game, blah, 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 blah. So we knew we weren't going to blow the introductions and the demonstration. And when you see the replica built downstairs, you find that you can push a button, out comes a verbal introduction to the game. So the first time in the history of video games, we had video games that were introduced by voiceover. The board of directors had been in session that day. So instead of having the president and the VP, the executive VP, was surrounded by about 6 or 8 guys. And after we finished the demonstration, most of them were like this, A couple of them said, hey, keep it up. Royden Sanders, the president, all he said was, show me how we can make money off this. So we knew we had to do something. Doing hardware, designing circuitry, if that's your trade, that's not so hard, right? Yeah. Selling this stuff, or getting it on a license, that's the hard part. And that's why, like we said earlier today, the marketeers drive around in Cadillacs, and us engineers, we drive Fords, right? Toyotas.
The next step was to make their gadget appealing to consumers. The brown box with its controller was the first finished prototype that allowed the user to control an image, which makes it the ancestor of the PlayStation, the Nintendo, and the Xbox 360.
Well, I have to give Bill full credit for whatever physical things were done. He did them. And I don't know whether I probably suggested that we dress them brown box up, but I bet it was you who went to the store and bought some self-adhesive paper for the board of directors and the president of the company. That was a chassis full of parts, discrete transistors, resistors, capacitors, all of which Bill designed. He did all the design work. As we went on to the little box that was supposed to be a product that got to be too expensive, again, what was on the 3 plug-in cards were discrete transistors. Yes, we played with early integrated circuits, you know, the kind of thing where there's lots of transistors on one chip in a package. But the problem was twofold. First of all, they were too expensive back then, and secondly, they drew too much current. He built circuitry by using a copper clad, the kind of stuff you make printed circuit out of, and sticking little insulated, soldering little insulated standoffs on it, and supporting all the transistors and resistors off those insulated standoffs.
Baer recognizes that Harrison also created the light gun.
He went to Sears, bought a plastic gun, opened it up, you know, made some room for the circuit board, built some hardware, stuck it inside, put a photo sensor in the barrel, and the optics were the barrel. There was no lens. And it's just, you know, when you look through a long barrel, you get a small view of the distance. And so we had a dark screen, and if there was a white spot on the screen, that's what the gun imaged, you know. And there was an output from the photocell. He built an amplifier that made the signal bigger. And if you pull the trigger and the light from the photocell and the trigger signal were coincident, at that moment you had a hit. Yeah.
If the spot would disappear.
Bingo. So the next job was to take that big chassis and take those things that worked pretty well, put them into a little box, which was TV game number 3. Had 3 plug-in boards inside and 2 knobs on each side to move 2 spots around, and a little handgun to shoot at the screen with, a light gun. And when we got done, Bill did a bill of materials and priced it as best we knew how. And what did we know about pricing commercial product? Nothing.
The missing element to Baer and Harrison's game was supplied by a third person. Engineer Bill Rash inserted a third dot, controlled by the computer. Now the challenge was complete, since this third element was independent of the player's commands. Soon, this dot became the ball in field games like baseball, handball, volleyball, basketball, tennis, and ping pong.
Once we had a ping pong game going, we knew we were in business. Here again, once we built the first ping pong game, the question was, now that I got it, what do I do with it? Where do I go? Who will build this thing?
The first answer to this question was to introduce the concept to cable television companies, which at the time had fewer than 100,000 subscribers. Baer suggested they create interactive video game channels, an idea that was 40 years ahead of its time.
Because all it took at the cable station is to take a camera, point it at a nice colorful chart, and say the stands at Wimbledon, you know, a tennis game, the court in the front, and we key our two spots, and we didn't even need the line in the middle. If they did the picture right, key our 2 player spots, paddles, and the ball over that background, and we have a nice, rich-looking presentation instead of sticking overlays on top of the screen.
At the time, however, the cable companies showed little interest in what today has become a major segment of their business. This led Baer to the TV manufacturers once he realized his new game used many of the same components found in your everyday TV set.
First to come in was RCA. We actually got into a protracted contract negotiation with them, but they thought we were a little company, they were a big company, and they made the terms so onerous that we decided not to go with them. Fortunately for us, a member of the team the RCA team, left RCA, became a vice president for marketing at Magnavox in their sales office in New York. And he was so impressed with what he saw that he called up the people in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the headquarters where all the engineering was, and said, you ought to look at that once more. I tell you, when the VP in New York told those guys in Fort Wayne to invite us in, and we made the demonstration, which kicked the whole thing off. When that happened, we knew we were eventually going to get a license, but it took our lawyer, corporate director of patents, and their lawyers a whole year to grind out a contract. So now our old design, a design that Bill did basically in 67, 68, is already 3 years old, right? And electronics moves like crazy in 3 years, right? And we went back once more, I think. Yeah. But after that, it was a hands-off situation. They're different company, we're one company, another company, and they didn't really feel that they needed us in any way. And in fact, they didn't really, because they did a really nice job converting a brown box into a producible and good-looking and practical piece of equipment. We didn't know, for example, which we found out much, much later, in fact, Bill really doesn't really know anything about this, that they spent an entire 6 months after they made about 6 or 8 handmade prototypes going all around the country with doing consumer acceptance testing, some of which is reproduced in my book, to find out whether people would really like to do that. And if you look at those records, they're uniformly positive. People really like the idea, really like playing, especially big power.
Finally, on May 3, 1972, Magnavox decided to take the lead and offered consumers the first video game home console, which they called Odyssey Magnavox.
Here we go, up and down and up. He's getting tricky. Missed it, one up. Keep it on the table, Baer. Here we go. Fake you out again, 2 to 1. We'll play up to 5, huh? Good show. Get closer to the net, make it a little faster. Well, 2 up.
In the same way that Christopher Columbus is recognized as the discoverer of the Americas, even though the presence of the Vikings on the North American continent prior to 1492 has been well established, Ralph Baer is universally recognized as the father of home video games, despite occasional claims to the contrary. It was Baer, with his little brown box, who gave kids the world over the ability to manipulate electronically generated images, thereby transforming the world into one huge virtual battlefield.
When we did all the work, it was a small idea that might wind up in a small box that you attach to hopefully a large number of television sets. There was no concept of this thing mushrooming into a gigantic industry. Who could have foreseen that? But looking back, of course, the fact of the matter is, I did have the idea, I did have the concept. I sat down in the morning of September 1st, 1966, wrote a 4-page paper. If you look at what I proposed, it's all there. And not only did we have the idea, I didn't sit on it. I put a technician to work. We started working on it. Yeah. After a little while, we brought another tech on board. Bill came on board. And inside of a year's time, we were really done, only we didn't know it. For example, we were, when we got to box number 6, we were playing ping pong, handball, volleyball, chase games. We didn't have to go on to the brown box. It was just us engineers saying, a couple more transistors here, and we'd get some more games going. We should have stopped when we were done with Game 6. Be that as it may, we got a snowball going, which just rolled down the hill and got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. What did we contribute? A lot of stuff. you have to admit that if I hadn't done what I did, and guys with me like Bill hadn't done what they did, it would have happened anyway. Because sooner or later, personal computers would have come in, and they would have figured it out that what guys want to do with a personal computer is play games, 90% of the time. After that comes word processing and spreadsheets. Yeah, but games are it.
The impact that video games had in the life of yesterday's children, who are today's adults, has been extraordinary. Steve Wozniak, who's the founder of Apple Computers, once said, "I'll never be able to thank Ralph Baer enough for what he has given me, and everyone else."
I met Steve about 4 years ago when I got inducted into the Computer Museum in Bozeman, Montana. And he was the keynote speaker, and we spent a couple of days together. He's such a really nice guy. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, the reason I wanted to build a computer is because I want to play games. I've been playing video games all this time, right?
In Baer's judgment, the work Magnavox did was very good, although its marketing strategy was flawed.
At Magnavox, they did a really good job. The thing that did poorly was when they finally announced the product in May of '72 and went public. They made it look at first as if you need a television set made by Magnavox to attach the Odyssey to, and that kept the sales down. And the other problem was that in those days, Magnavox had their own dealerships. You walk into a Magnavox store, everything in there was Magnavox. You didn't just walk into a radio store. There was no such thing as today's electronic stores. You didn't walk into a radio store and see Magnavox set next to a television set. You could, but most Magnavox sets were in their proprietary store. That stopped about 2 years later because it was an antitrust problem, which the government recognized and made them stop. But what did that do? It restricted sales to those stores. Instead of being in 5,000 stores in New York, they were in 50. That didn't help the sales. Even so, they sold close to 100,000 Odysseys, the one-tail 200 model, in that season, October, November, December '72. And then by early '74, when it was all over, there was an antique machine. They had sold a total of 350,000, which isn't too bad. Think about that, 350,000 machines in homes. So at least 3 or 4 people in the family have looked at it, played with it. They had friends over, so multiply by 5, and you got 1.5 million people who have been introduced to home video games.
Baer worked at Sanders for 30 years. Harrison stayed in the company until 1978. However, today, with both of them retired, they remain very good friends.
I've been doing touring game design now for 25, 30 years, and the first 95% are always relatively easy. It's that last 5% that gets you. You know, you spend 3 times as much time on the last 5%, because that's when all the problems come up and bite you in the rear. I think we wouldn't be as close if we hadn't shared this unusual history at Sanders.
Baer's extraordinary contribution to the industry has been recognized not only by developers and video game fanatics, but also by the American Inventors Association, which made him a member. He also received the United States National Medal of Technology Award, granted by President George W. Bush himself on February 13, 2004.
The 2004 National Medal of Technology is awarded to Ralph H. Baer for his groundbreaking and pioneering creation, development, and commercialization of interactive video games, which spawned related uses, applications, and mega industries in both the entertainment and education realms.
So, I mean, looking back, are we proud of what we did? Sure we are. But that's why we brought teleprompter up. We had the vision, but we didn't have the tools. And there wasn't the money. Right. So it all died courtesy of the cable. And in fact, I remember it was all close to midnight when we got done at the studio in Malden, Massachusetts, near Boston. We went home and we stopped off for a bite because we were starving and we were hungry.
Nice steak dinner.
Yeah, we had a steak dinner, and we were all jumping up and down because here we are, two guys, engineers, working in a huge military electronics company, and we sort of had we did what we wanted to do, we did it when we wanted to do it, and nobody cared because a ton of money was coming in through licenses and through the lawsuits on video games. We had the best of all worlds at the time. Take my greetings along to Venezuela from my wife, my kids, who are all over the place in Colorado, in Utah, in the state of Washington, and for my friend David Winter in Paris. Let's all have a good year together.